You smell it before you see him. The putrid, sweet stench of rotting flesh that permeates even the grandest chambers of Whitehall Palace in this winter of 1546. As you approach the king's privy chamber, the odour grows stronger, mixing with the cloying perfumes that courtiers douse themselves with in futile attempts to mask the reality of what Henry VIII has become. The guards at the door wear expressions of barely concealed revulsion, their faces turned slightly away as they bow. Through the heavy oak doors, gilded with the royal arms that once struck fear into the hearts of Europe's monarchs, you hear it, the laboured wheezing of a man whose body has become his prison. Step inside and witness what few dare to acknowledge. The most feared king in Christendom is dying, and he knows it. The chamber reeks of suppuration and death. Henry VIII, once the golden prince who danced until dawn and rode to hounds with inexhaustible energy, now lies propped against silk cushions, his massive frame a grotesque monument to excess and decay. His leg, that cursed leg that has tormented him for over a decade, seeps constantly through the bandages, staining the pristine linens with yellow and green discharge that no amount of washing can cleanse. You watch as the king's physicians hover like carrion birds around his throne-like chair. Dr. George Owen, the king's personal physician, approaches with fresh dressings, his face a mask of professional composure that cannot quite hide his disgust. The wound on Henry's left thigh, opened during a jousting accident in 1536 and never properly healed, has become a festering crater that medical historians would later theorise contained bone fragments and dead tissue that no Tudor surgeon dared to properly excise. "Your Majesty," Owen murmurs, kneeling with practised deference, "we must change the dressing again." Henry's response is a growl that might once have sent men to the Tower. Now it is the sound of a wounded beast, all bluster and no substance. His face, once handsome enough to inspire poets, has swollen into a grotesque caricature of monarchy. Tiny eyes peer out from folds of flesh, and his breath comes in short, painful gasps that speak of a heart struggling under the burden of his immense weight. The king weighs nearly 300 pounds now, his body a monument to decades of gluttony and indulgence. His doublets must be specially constructed with whalebone stays to support his bulk, and it takes 4 strong men to move him from bed to chair. The golden beard that once framed a face of princely beauty is now streaked with grey and stained with spittle and food, but it is his eyes that tell the true story of these final months. Behind the pain and the rage burns something far more terrifying than any tyrant's wrath: fear. Henry VIII, who has sent 2 wives to the scaffold, who has broken with Rome and dissolved the monasteries, who has executed more nobles than any English king in history, is afraid. Around him, the court continues its elaborate dance of deception. Courtiers glide across the polished floors of Whitehall in their silk and velvet finery, their conversations conducted in whispers and meaningful glances. They speak of the weather, of hunting, of anything but the obvious truth, that their king is dying and with him an entire world is about to collapse. Watch Thomas Seymour as he enters the chamber, his footsteps silent on the Turkey carpets. Brother to the late Queen Jane Seymour and uncle to Prince Edward, Thomas moves with the predatory grace of a man who scents opportunity in the stench of decay. His clothes are immaculate, a doublet of midnight blue silk slashed with cloth of gold, hose that fit his legs like a second skin, a short cloak lined with ermine. But his eyes never leave the king's face, searching for signs of weakness, for the moment when the great game of succession will truly begin. Behind Thomas comes his elder brother Edward, Lord Hertford, a man of different temperament but equal ambition. Where Thomas is flash and charm, Edward is calculation and cold pragmatism. He has spent months positioning himself as the future protector of young Prince Edward, and you can see in his measured movements the confidence of a man who believes destiny is on his side. The Seymour brothers exchange no words, but the tension between them is palpable. They are allies now, united in their determination to control the young prince who will inherit this rotting kingdom. But you sense the fault lines of future conflict already forming. Power shared is power diminished, and neither man strikes you as capable of such sharing for long. Henry's current wife, Catherine Parr, enters with her usual quiet dignity. The 6th Queen has survived longer than any since Catherine of Aragon, and her secret lies in her ability to make herself nearly invisible when necessary. She wears mourning colours, deep purple silk that rustles softly as she moves, though whether she mourns for her husband or for herself you cannot say. Catherine approaches the king's chair with practised care, her face a masterpiece of wifely concern. She has learned the precise distance to maintain, close enough to demonstrate devotion, far enough to avoid the worst of the stench. In her hands she carries a small leather-bound book, her own translation of prayers and meditations. It is a dangerous thing to possess in these times, for Henry's religious views shift like weather, and what pleases him one day may damn you the next. "My lord," she says, her voice carefully modulated to convey respect without intimacy, "I have brought the prayers you requested." Henry's response is a grunt, but his eyes fix on the book with something approaching hunger. In these final months, the man who broke England's ancient faith has become obsessed with salvation, terrified that the soul he has spent a lifetime imperiling might yet face eternal damnation. The irony would be amusing if it were not so grotesque. Henry Tudor, who declared himself supreme head of the Church of England, who burned heretics and Catholics alike, who dissolved monasteries and scattered their treasures to reward his courtiers, now lies awake at night consumed by religious terror. His confessor, Dr. Richard Cox, has become one of the most powerful men in the kingdom, for he alone can offer the king what no earthly treasure can buy: hope of forgiveness. You notice how the courtiers position themselves around the chamber, a human chessboard where every move carries the weight of life and death. Near the windows, Bishop Stephen Gardiner converses quietly with Sir William Paget, the king's principal secretary. Gardiner represents the old faith, the Catholic traditions that Henry spent decades dismantling, while Paget embodies the new pragmatism that has kept him alive through 3 decades of royal service. Their conversation appears casual, but you catch fragments that reveal the true nature of their discourse. The boy must be guided. The old ways have wisdom. Reform must be balanced with tradition. They are planning for a future without Henry, and each man believes his vision will prevail. In the shadows near the door you spot Thomas Cranmer, Archbishop of Canterbury, the architect of Henry's break with Rome. Cranmer moves like a man walking on ice, aware that each step could send him plummeting into the abyss. His Protestant reforms have made him powerful enemies, and with Henry dying, those enemies sharpen their knives. The Archbishop's pale hands shake slightly as he clutches his prayer book. Whether from age, cold, or fear you cannot determine. The chamber itself reflects the decay of its master. Once these rooms blazed with gold and tapestries depicting Henry's victories at Flodden Field and the Field of the Cloth of Gold. Now, many of the finest pieces have been moved away, officially for cleaning, but really to prevent the king's corruption from staining them permanently. The remaining furnishings bear witness to Henry's condition. Chairs reinforced with iron bands, carpets stained with medicinal spills, windows kept tightly shuttered to contain the odours. Yet even in decay, the trappings of majesty remain. The cloth of estate above Henry's chair still bears the royal arms in gold thread. Servants still approach on their knees. The elaborate rituals of kingship continue, though they now feel like a macabre performance staged for an audience of ghosts. Dr. Owen finishes changing the dressing on Henry's leg, and the king's roar of pain echoes off the chamber walls. For a moment, the mask of majesty slips completely, and you see him as he truly is, a sick, frightened old man trapped in a body that has become his enemy. His face contorts in agony, and tears, actual tears, leak from his swollen eyes. The courtiers pretend not to notice. In this world of absolute monarchy, the king's humanity is a state secret more dangerous than any military: intelligence. To acknowledge Henry's weakness would be to question the divine nature of kingship itself, and such questions have a way of leading their questioners to the block. But you can see the knowledge in their eyes. Every person in this chamber understands that they are witnessing the end of an era. Henry VIII has ruled England for 37 years, longer than many of his subjects have been alive. His will has been law, his word has been truth, his anger has been death. Now, as his body fails, the entire structure of Tudor power trembles. Young Prince Edward, just 9 years old, is the key to everything. He's been kept away from his father's sick room, officially to protect him from infection, but really to shield him from the reality of mortality. The boy who will be Edward VI knows his father is unwell, but he cannot comprehend that he stands on the threshold of inheriting a kingdom in chaos. The prince's supporters gather in the antechambers, their voices low but their ambitions high. The Seymour brothers believe their blood connection to the future king gives them the strongest claim to power. Bishop Gardiner and his conservative allies hope to roll back the Protestant reforms that have split the church. The reformers, led by Cranmer, pray that young Edward's Protestant education will preserve their revolution. And at the centre of it all lies Henry VIII, a dying tyrant whose every laboured breath reshapes the political landscape of England. The afternoon light filtering through the shuttered windows grows dim, and servants enter to light the candles. The flames cast dancing shadows on the walls, and in their flickering glow you see the king's face transform into something from a fever dream. His eyes, sunken deep in folds of flesh, glitter with an unnatural brightness. His breathing grows more laboured, and the stench from his wounds seems to intensify. "Leave us," Henry suddenly commands, his voice a hoarse whisper that somehow carries more authority than the thunderous roars of his youth. All but Paget and Denny. The chamber empties with the fluid efficiency of a court accustomed to royal whims. Sir William Paget and Sir Anthony Denny, the king's most trusted advisers, remain behind. These are the men who have become Henry's closest confidants in his final months, not because he loves them, but because they alone possess the perfect combination of competence and civility that allows them to serve a dying tyrant without triggering his paranoia. As the door closes behind the last departing courtier, you catch a glimpse of the conversation that will shape England's future. Three men discussing the transfer of power in a kingdom where such discussions have traditionally ended at the headsman's block. But the doors close, and you are left to contemplate what you have witnessed. In this fetid chamber at Whitehall Palace, surrounded by the ghosts of Henry's victims and the vultures who await his death, the most powerful monarch in Europe is learning the one lesson that no amount of royal authority can forestall, that even kings are mortal. The question that hangs in the air, heavy as the stench of corruption, is not whether Henry will die. That outcome grows more certain with each passing day. The question is what will happen to England when he does. For in this winter of 1546, as snow falls on the Thames and covers the blood-soaked ground of Tower Green, a kingdom holds its breath and waits to see whether the Tudor dynasty will survive the death of its most terrible king. And in the shadows of Whitehall Palace, ambitious men sharpen their knives and prepare for the greatest game of all, the battle for a crown that will soon lack a head to wear it. The secret meeting takes place in the dead of winter night, 3 weeks before Henry's death, in a chamber beneath the royal kitchens where the stone walls sweat with condensation and the air tastes of ash and conspiracy. You descend the narrow spiral staircase, following the flicker of a single candle held by a cloaked figure whose identity you cannot yet discern. Here, in the bowels of Whitehall Palace, the future of England is being decided by men who dare not speak their treasons in daylight. The chamber is small, cramped, furnished only with a rough wooden table and several stools that creak ominously under the weight of their occupants. But the men gathered around that table wield more power than armies. Edward Seymour, Earl of Hertford, sits at the head of the table with the natural authority of one born to command. His face, carved from granite and shadow, shows no emotion as he spreads a document across the scarred wood. Even in this subterranean hideaway, he is dressed impeccably. Doublet of black velvet, white linen collar starched to perfection, rings that catch the candlelight like captured stars. "Gentlemen," Hertford begins, his voice barely above a whisper, yet carrying absolute conviction. His Majesty grows weaker by the day. We must speak of what cannot be spoken. Beside him sits Sir William Paget, the King's principal secretary, a man whose survival through Henry's reign speaks to an almost supernatural ability to read the political winds. Paget's thin fingers trace patterns on the table as he speaks, and you notice how the others lean forward to catch his words. In Henry's court, information is power, and Paget controls the flow of both. "The physicians give him days, perhaps weeks," Paget murmurs. "Doctor, Owen spoke to me privately yesterday. The corruption in his legs spreads upward. The humours of his body are in complete disorder. He cannot last much longer." You watch as the third conspirator shifts in his seat. Sir Anthony Denny, groom of the stool and keeper of the king's most intimate secrets. Denny's position gives him unique access to Henry's private moments, and his pale, nervous features suggest the burden of knowledge weighs heavily upon him. He speaks constantly of Prince Edward, Denny's, reveals, his voice trembling slightly. "Last night he wept." actually wept, speaking of the boy's future. He knows he will not live to see his son reach majority. The implications hang in the air like smoke from the guttering candles. Prince Edward is only 9 years old. Under English law, he cannot rule independently until he reaches his majority at 18. For 9 years, someone must govern England in his name. The question of who will wield that power has kept these men awake for months. Hertford leans back in his chair, and in the candlelight his face takes on the appearance of a marble effigy. The King's will names a council of regency, he says carefully. 16 men, each with equal voice in the governance of the realm. A recipe for chaos, Paget interjects sharply. 16 voices will produce 16 different policies. The kingdom needs strong leadership, not a debating society. You can see the game being played out in their expressions. Hertford is Prince Edward's uncle through his deceased sister Jane Seymour. By blood and precedent, he has the strongest claim to serve as Lord Protector, ruling England until the young king comes of age. But the other councillors, men like Bishop Stephen Gardiner, Thomas Wriothesley and John Dudley, will not yield power easily. Gardiner must be neutralised, Hertford states flatly. His conservative faction will undo everything we have achieved. They would drag England back to Rome if they could. The religious dimension of the succession crisis cannot be understated. Henry broke with Rome to marry Anne Boleyn and secure a male heir, but his religious settlement satisfied neither Catholic nor Protestant. The Old Believers, led by Gardiner, see young Edward's reign as an opportunity to restore traditional practices. The Reformers, inspired by continental Protestantism, hope to push England further from its Catholic past. Denny reaches into his doublet and produces a small leather pouch, which he places on the table with infinite care. "His Majesty gave me this yesterday," he whispers. "He said it contains his final instructions for Prince Edward's education and upbringing." The three men stare at the pouch as if it were a viper. Inside those folded papers lies the key to England's future, Henry's last attempt to control events from beyond the grave. But they all understand that dead kings, no matter how terrible in life, hold no swords. "The boy must be secured immediately upon his father's death," Hertford declares, "brought to London under our protection before Gardiner or his allies can reach him. Prince Edward is currently at Hertford Castle, some 20 miles north of London, surrounded by tutors and servants carefully chosen by his father. The castle is strong, defensible, but also isolated. In the chaos that will follow Henry's death, control of the young king's person will determine who controls the kingdom." Paget nods slowly. "I have men positioned along the Great North Road. The moment word comes from Whitehall, they will ride to Hertford. The prince can be in London within hours." "And the Tower?" Hertford asks. "Secured," Denny replies. "Sir John Markham commands the garrison, and he owes his position to your recommendation. The royal treasury, the crown jewels, the armaments, all will be under our control." You marvel at the thoroughness of their planning. These men have spent months preparing for this moment, positioning their allies, neutralising their enemies, securing the instruments of power. Yet beneath their confidence you sense an undercurrent of desperation. They are gambling everything on their ability to move faster and strike harder than their rivals. The conversation turns to the practical mechanics of revolution, for that is what they are planning, though they would never use such a word. They discuss which nobles can be trusted, which must be watched, which eliminated. They review the loyalty of garrison commanders, the reliability of sheriffs, the political inclinations of bishops. "Thomas Seymour grows impatient," Hertford remarks, referring to his younger brother. "He believes his charm and royal connections entitle him to a greater role." Paget's thin smile carries no warmth. "Your brother is useful but dangerous. His ambitions exceed his judgment. You can see the family tension playing out even in this moment of alliance. Thomas Seymour possesses all the qualities his elder brother lacks: wit, charm, physical beauty, the ability to inspire devotion. But he also possesses the fatal flaw of believing his own propaganda. Where Edward Seymour calculates, Thomas acts on impulse." "He will be managed," Hertford says curtly, but you detect uncertainty in his voice. Managing Thomas Seymour will prove to be like managing a whirlwind. Theoretically possible, but practically disastrous. The meeting continues deep into the night, covering every detail of their conspiracy. They discuss how to present Henry's death to the kingdom, gradually, carefully, allowing time for their forces to consolidate. They plan the coronation of young Edward VI, the composition of his council, the religious policies of the new reign. But as you watch these men plot in their underground chamber, you begin to understand a fundamental truth about power. It cannot be shared equally among unequal ambitions. Each of these conspirators believes he can control the others, that his vision will ultimately triumph. They are allies of convenience, bound together by mutual need but destined for mutual betrayal. Hertford produces another document, a draft proclamation announcing Prince Edward's accession to the throne. The words are carefully chosen to emphasise continuity with his father's reign, while subtly indicating the new directions the government will take. References to true religion and godly reform signal to Protestant supporters that changes are coming. Bishop Gardiner will not be deceived, Paget observes. Though, the moment this proclamation is read, he will understand that his faction has been outmanoeuvred. Let him understand, Hertford replies coldly. Understanding and acting are different things. By the time he grasps the situation, it will be too late to change it. Yet even as they speak, you sense that their enemies are not idle. In other chambers throughout Whitehall, in manor houses across England, in cathedral closes and monastery ruins, other men are making other plans. The Catholic faction, led by Gardiner and Norfolk, has its own network of supporters. The moderate Conservatives, represented by men like Lord Chancellor Wriothesley, seek to preserve Henry's religious settlement without further reform. Most dangerously, there are those who question whether Prince Edward should inherit at all. Henry's elder daughter, Mary, declared illegitimate by Parliament but never formally removed from the succession, has her own supporters among those who remember her mother Catherine of Aragon with fondness. A Catholic restoration under Queen Mary would sweep away not just the Protestant reforms, but the men who implemented them. The candles burn lower as the meeting reaches its conclusion. These men have committed themselves to a course of action that will either make them the most powerful figures in England or see them follow their predecessors to the Tower Green. There is no middle path, no safe retreat from the choices they have made. Hertford rolls up the documents and secures them in an oiled leather case. "Gentlemen," he says formally, "we are agreed. Upon His Majesty's death, Prince Edward will be proclaimed king immediately. The Council of Regency will meet within hours to confirm the arrangements for his minority. The kingdom's government will continue without interruption." The words sound reasonable, even reassuring. But you understand the subtext. These men intend to seize power in a royal coup disguised as constitutional continuity. They will rule England through a child king, making decisions in his name while pursuing their own agendas. As the conspirators prepare to depart, returning to their official roles as loyal servants of the crown, you catch a glimpse of the document Denny brought, Henry's final instructions for his son. In the flickering candlelight, you can make out fragments of the royal handwriting, shakier now than in the king's prime, but still bearing the unmistakable authority of majesty. The words you can discern speak of duty, of the burden of kingship, of the need to preserve England's independence from foreign powers. But there is something else, references to true religion and godly princes, that suggest Henry's own uncertainty about the religious revolution he unleashed. Denny carefully replaces the document in his doublet, but not before you notice something that sends a chill through the underground chamber. The papers are stained with what appears to be blood, drops of the corrupted fluid that weeps constantly from Henry's wounds. Even his final words to his son bear the mark of his physical decay. The meeting dissolves as quietly as it began. The conspirators extinguish their candles and slip away through different passages, returning to their chambers to await the moment that will transform them from plotters to rulers. But as you follow the last flickering light up the spiral staircase, you carry with you the knowledge of how kingdoms change hands, not through grand proclamations or noble ceremonies, but through whispered conversations in hidden places, through careful preparation and ruthless execution. Above you, in his fetid chamber, Henry VIII continues his agonizing journey toward death, unaware that his most trusted servants have already begun to carve up his kingdom. The tyrant who never brooked opposition in life has become, in his weakness, the unwitting enabler of the greatest conspiracy in English royal history. And somewhere in the distance the bells of London's churches toll the hours, marking time until the moment when a 9-year-old boy will wake to find himself King of England, surrounded by men who claim to serve him, but who have already decided to rule through him. The game of succession has begun, and the stakes could not be higher. The the future of the English crown, the fate of religious reform, and the lives of all who have chosen sides in the coming struggle for power. January 28, 1547. The great clock of Westminster strikes 2 in the morning, its bronze voice echoing across the frozen Thames as England's most feared monarch draws his final breaths. You stand in the shadows of the King's bedchamber, witness to the death throes of an era. The room reeks of mortality and melted wax. Dozens of candles burn in silver sconces, their flames creating a cathedral of light around Henry's deathbed. But no amount of illumination can disguise the horror of what the king has become. His massive frame, once the embodiment of royal power, now resembles a beached leviathan, swollen beyond recognition and ravaged by decades of excess. Henry's breathing comes in wet, rattling gasps that seem to shake the very foundations of Whitehall Palace. Each exhalation might be his last, yet he clings to life with the same stubborn will that broke Rome's authority over England. His eyes, when they flutter open, still burn with the intelligence that has terrorised courtiers for 37 years, but the fire grows dimmer with each passing hour. Archbishop Thomas Cranmer kneels beside the royal bed, his weathered hands clasped in desperate prayer. The architect of England's Protestant Reformation knows that his master's death will unleash forces that could destroy everything they have built together. Cranmer's lips move silently, but you wonder whether he prays for Henry's soul or for his own survival in the chaos to come. "Your Majesty," Cranmer whispers, leaning closer to the dying king's ear. "Can you hear me, sire?" Henry's response is barely audible, a whisper that carries the weight of kingdoms. "Edward, my boy, protect him." These words, perhaps the last coherent thoughts of Henry VIII, reveal the tragedy at the heart of his reign. The king who destroyed lives in pursuit of a male heir now faces death knowing that his precious son will inherit a fractured kingdom at age 9, surrounded by wolves who will devour the boy's authority while paying lip service to his crown. Sir Anthony Denny stands at the foot of the bed, his face pale as parchment. As groom of the stool, Denny has attended Henry's most private moments for years, but nothing has prepared him for this final vigil. In his hands, he clutches the leather dispatch case containing orders that will reshape England within hours of the king's death, orders that Henry himself will never live to see implemented. The conspirators from that underground meeting 3 weeks ago are all present, their faces masks of appropriate grief while their minds calculate the timing of their coup. Edward Seymour, Earl of Hertford, maintains his position near the door with military precision. His brother Thomas paces restlessly by the windows, his handsome features twisted with an emotion that might be genuine sorrow or frustrated ambition. Sir William Paget remains at his writing desk in the corner, even now managing the flood of dispatches that keeps England functioning. But you notice how his eyes never stray far from the dying king, waiting for the moment when Henry's authority dies with him, and their carefully laid plans can finally be set in motion. Dr. George Owen, the royal physician, hovers uselessly beside his patient. Medical science in 1547 can do nothing for a man whose body has become a battlefield of competing diseases. The ulcerated leg that has tormented Henry for over a decade now seeps constantly through multiple layers of bandages. His heart, overburdened by his immense weight, struggles to pump blood through arteries clogged with the detritus of countless banquets. His kidneys, poisoned by years of rich food and strong wine, can barely function. Yet perhaps the most telling symptom of Henry's condition is his mind's clarity in these final hours. The king who spent months raving about conspiracies and betrayals now speaks with startling lucidity about his failures and fears. It is as if approaching death has burned away the delusions that sustained him through his tyrannical reign. "I have been a great sinner," Henry whispers to Cranmer, his voice barely audible above the crackling of the fire. "Will he forgive me?" The question that has haunted Henry's final months now receives Cranmer's gentle reassurance, but you see the doubt in the Archbishop's eyes. How does one absolve a man who has sent thousands to their deaths, including 2 of his own wives? What penance can balance the scales of such systematic cruelty? As the hours pass, messengers begin arriving at Whitehall with increasing frequency. Word of the king's condition has spread throughout London despite official attempts at secrecy. The great nobles of England are gathering their retainers, the bishops are calculating their allegiances, and the common people sense that momentous change approaches. From your position in the shadows, you witness the final performance of Tudor monarchy. Even in extremis, Henry remains surrounded by the rituals of kingship. Servants continue to approach on their knees. Courtiers speak in whispers. The cloth of estate above his bed still bears the royal arms in golden thread, though the man beneath it can barely lift his head. But the reality beneath the ceremony is starkly different. Power is already flowing away from the dying king toward those who will control his successor. You watch as Hertford and Paget exchange meaningful glances, confirming arrangements made in secret. Thomas Seymour receives a folded paper from Denny, possibly news from Hertford Castle, where Prince Edward waits unknowingly for his father's death. The religious implications of this transition cannot be overstated. Henry's break with Rome created a theological revolution that satisfied no one completely. Catholics longed for reunion with the papal church, while Protestant reformers pushed for more radical changes. Young Prince Edward's education has been thoroughly Protestant, guided by tutors who filled his mind with reformist theology, but his reign will begin under the control of men whose own religious convictions remain fluid. Bishop Stephen Gardiner's absence from this deathbed scene speaks volumes. The leader of the Conservative faction has been deliberately excluded from Henry's final hours, denied the chance to whisper counsel into the dying king's ear. His supporters, men like Thomas Howard, Duke of Norfolk, and Lord Chancellor Wriothesley, find themselves similarly marginalised as the Protestant alliance consolidates its grip on power. You can see the future taking shape in the careful positioning of bodies around Henry's deathbed. Those closest to the king are those who will control his successor. Those forced to stand at the periphery represent the faction that has already lost the battle for England's soul. At precisely 4 o'clock in the morning, Henry VIII's breathing changes. The wet, laboured gasps become shallower, more irregular. Cranmer leans closer, holding a small silver crucifix before the dying king's eyes. "Your Majesty, if you trust in Christ for salvation, give me some sign." Henry's response is barely perceptible, a slight pressure of his swollen hand against Cranmer's palm. It is the last conscious act of the man who styled himself God's vice-regent on earth, a gesture of faith from a monarch who spent his reign redefining faith itself. The room falls silent except for the crackling of flames and the distant tolling of church bells across London. Henry's chest rises and falls with increasing difficulty, each breath a monumental effort that shakes his entire frame. His face, grotesquely swollen yet somehow peaceful, takes on the waxy appearance of approaching death. At 23 minutes past 4 o'clock on the morning of January 28th, 1547, Henry VIII, by the grace of God, King of England and Ireland, defender of the faith, and supreme head of the Church of England, draws his final breath. The exhalation that has been building for minutes finally escapes his lips with a sound like winter wind through bare branches. The silence that follows is absolute and terrifying. For a moment no one moves, no one speaks, no one acknowledges what has just occurred. In that frozen instant, England exists without a king, a condition so fundamentally contrary to Tudor political theory that it cannot be permitted to last. Hertford breaks the spell, stepping forward to close Henry's eyes with a gesture that manages to be both reverent and decisive. "The king is dead," he announces formally. "Long live the king." The ritual response echoes through the chamber, but the words ring hollow. Edward VI lives, but he sleeps in ignorance at Hertford Castle, while men who claim to serve him consolidate power in his name. The new king will wake this morning to find himself a monarch, but it will be months before he truly understands what that means. Paget immediately begins drafting proclamations that will announce Edward's accession to his subjects. The language is carefully crafted to emphasise continuity. The boy king will govern with the same wisdom as his father, guided by the same counsellors, pursuing the same policies. But those who understand the code words recognise the revolution hidden within the rhetoric. Denny produces the sealed orders that Henry signed in his final weeks, documents that officially establish the Council of Regency and outline the kingdom's governance during Edward's minority. But these papers are already obsolete, superseded by agreements made in midnight meetings and secret chambers. Within an hour of Henry's death, mounted messengers are racing north toward Hertford Castle with news that will transform Prince Edward from a sheltered boy into King Edward VI. Other riders carry letters to garrison commanders, naval officers, and provincial governors, ensuring that Henry's death is announced simultaneously throughout the realm before any opposition can organise. The speed and efficiency of these arrangements reveal the months of preparation that preceded this moment. Hertford's faction has anticipated every contingency, neutralised every threat, secured every instrument of power. By the time Henry's enemies realise what has happened, it will be too late to prevent it. Yet even in triumph, you sense the fragility of their position. They have seized control of a 9-year-old king, but children grow up. They have marginalised the conservative faction, but persecution creates martyrs, and martyrs inspire resistance. Most dangerously, they have based their authority on their ability to speak for a monarch who will eventually develop his own voice. As dawn breaks over London, painting the sky the colour of dried blood, Henry's body begins the process of transformation from monarch to monument. Royal embalmers will preserve his flesh, artists will create idealised portraits for posterity, and historians will debate his legacy. But the man himself, with all his cruelties and contradictions, his brilliance and brutality, has passed into legend. The kingdom he leaves behind bears the scars of his reign like wounds that refuse to heal. England's ancient faith lies in ruins, replaced by a religious settlement that satisfies no one. The nobility has been decimated by Henry's paranoid purges, their ranks filled with new men whose loyalty was purchased with monastic lands. The common people face an uncertain future, under a child king surrounded by ambitious regents. Most ominously, Henry's desperate pursuit of a male heir has created a succession crisis that his death has only temporarily resolved. Prince Edward is healthy and legitimate, but he's also 9 years old and the last Tudor male. Behind him in the succession stand his half-sisters Mary and Elizabeth. Mary, a Catholic who would restore papal authority. Elizabeth, a bastard whose very existence challenges the principles Henry died defending. As you leave the chamber where Henry VIII breathed his last, you carry with you the image of absolute power meeting absolute mortality. The king who never brooked opposition in life has become, in death, powerless to prevent the dismantling of everything he built. His will, his wishes, his carefully crafted succession plans matter nothing compared to the ambitions of living men who control living swords. The tyrant is dead, but tyranny lives on in new forms. The boy who will be crowned Edward VI within weeks has inherited more than a crown. He has inherited the contradictions and conflicts that his father's reign created but never resolved. And in the palaces and manor houses of England, ambitious men prepare to use that inheritance for their own purposes, ruling through a child while pursuing adult ambitions. The reign of Henry VIII is over, but the age of Henry VIII, with all its violence, religious upheaval, and political instability, has only just begun. The crown passes to new hands, but the problems that crown must solve remain as intractable as ever. And in the cold January dawn of 1547, as church bells across England toll for their dead king, the nation stands poised on the brink of changes that will make Henry's revolution seem like a gentle reformation. The Game of Thrones continues, played now by new players with higher stakes. The boy king sleeps on, unaware that his childhood ended in the same moment his father's breathing stopped. And England, that realm Henry shaped with fire and sword, awaits the next act in the bloody drama of Tudor succession. Now story number 2, the boy king's final days, Edward VI and the Protestant conspiracy. You stand in the shadow of Greenwich Palace's Great Hall on this bitter February morning of 1553, watching as courtiers whisper behind silk sleeves and jewelled hands. The very stones beneath your feet seem to hold their breath, for word has spread like wildfire through the corridors. The boy king lies dying, and with him dies the Protestant dream that has transformed England these past 6 years. Edward VI, barely 15 years old, sits propped against silk cushions in his private chamber, his once bright Tudor red hair now dull as autumn leaves, his pale skin almost translucent in the flickering candlelight. You can hear his laboured breathing even from the doorway, each rasp a reminder that the almighty God he has served so faithfully may be calling him home far too soon. The sweet scent of burning herbs, rosemary, lavender, and something more medicinal cannot quite mask the underlying odour of sickness that has settled over these royal apartments like a shroud. The boy's hands, once strong enough to draw a bow and steady enough to sign the death warrants of Catholic bishops, now tremble as he attempts to lift a goblet of watered wine to his lips. His personal physician, Dr. Thomas Wendy, hovers nearby with the devoted attention of a priest at altar. But you can see in the learned man's eyes what he dare not speak aloud. There is nothing more his medicine can accomplish. The king's body is failing, consumed by what the physicians whisper might be consumption of the lungs, though others speak in darker tones of poison or divine judgment. But it is not the dying boy who commands your closest attention this morning. It is the man who stands at the foot of the royal bed with the bearing of a predator who has caught scent of wounded prey. John Dudley, Duke of Northumberland, Lord President of the Privy Council and the most powerful man in England save for the King himself, watches Edward with eyes that calculate rather than mourn. His weathered face, marked by years of battlefield command and political manoeuvring, betrays nothing of the desperate schemes that you know must be churning behind those cold grey eyes. Northumberland has everything to lose when this boy dies. For 6 years, ever since he manoeuvred himself into power following the fall of the Duke of Somerset, he has ruled England as effectively as any king. The boy Edward, for all his learning and piety, has been malleable clay in the Duke's capable hands. Together they have torn down altars, melted chalices, burned religious paintings, and transformed England into a Protestant nation that would have been unrecognisable to Edward's father, the great Henry VIII. You watch as Northumberland steps closer to the bed, his voice low and urgent as he leans toward the failing king. "Your Majesty must consider the succession," he murmurs, though his words carry clearly in the hushed chamber. "Your sister Mary would undo everything we have. Accomplished. The Mass would return, the bishops would reclaim their palaces, and England would bow once more to Rome." The mention of Lady Mary Tudor sends a visible shudder through young Edward's frame. You have seen the king's half-sister only twice at court, but her presence lingered like the memory of incense in a cleansed church. Mary, now 37 years old and unmarried, has spent the past 6 years in stubborn resistance to her brother's religious reforms. She continues to hear Mass in her private chapel, continues to speak of England's rightful place within the Catholic fold, and has made no secret of her intention to restore the old faith should she inherit the crown. But the law... Edward's voice is barely more than a whisper, yet it carries the weight of genuine anguish. You can see the conflict playing across his pale features. The dutiful son who has been raised to respect the succession, established by his father's will, warring against the devout Protestant who cannot bear the thought of England returning to what he sees as papal darkness. Northumberland's response is swift and practised, as if he has rehearsed this conversation many times in the privacy of his own chambers. "The law can be changed, Your Majesty. Your father himself altered the succession twice, first to exclude your sisters, then to restore them. Parliament followed his will then, and they will follow yours now. You are God's anointed king, and it is your sacred duty to ensure that England remains in the light of true religion." The chamber falls silent save for the crackling of logs in the great fireplace and the soft scratch of a quill as the King's secretary continues his endless correspondence. But you can feel the tension in the air as surely as you can feel the February cold seeping through the palace walls. Every person in this room understands what Northumberland is truly proposing, nothing less than the overthrow of the established succession, the setting aside of both the Lady Mary and the Lady Elizabeth, in favour of someone more amenable to Protestant rule. Your eyes drift to the tapestries that adorn the chamber walls, their rich threads depicting scenes of biblical triumph, David slaying Goliath, Daniel in the lion's den, the children of Israel crossing the Red Sea. How fitting, you think, that a dying Protestant king should be surrounded by images of the chosen people delivered from their enemies. But which role does Edward play in this unfolding drama? Is he David, striking down the Goliath of Catholic restoration? Or is he more like Moses, glimpsing the promised land from afar but destined never to enter it himself? The sound of approaching footsteps in the corridor outside draws your attention back to the immediate moment. Sir William Cecil, the King's principal secretary, enters the chamber with the measured gait of a man bearing weighty news. His normally composed features show signs of strain, the pressed lips, the slight furrow, between his brows that speaks of sleepless nights spent wrestling with impossible choices. Cecil approaches the bed with evident reluctance, as if he understands that whatever words he brings will push events past the point of return. "Your Majesty," he begins, his voice carefully neutral, "I've prepared the documents you requested, the letters patent regarding the succession." The papers he carries seem to glow in the candlelight like illuminated manuscripts, their significance far beyond their physical weight. You realise you are witnessing history in the making, the moment when a dying boy king attempts to reshape the future of England according to his own vision of divine will. But as Edward reaches out with trembling hands to receive the documents, you cannot help but wonder, is this truly the king's own desire, or has the Duke of Northumberland finally achieved his masterpiece of manipulation? The boy's eyes, bright with fever and conviction, seem to burn with genuine religious fervour as he studies the words that would exclude his Catholic sister from the throne. Yet there is something else there too, a shadow of doubt perhaps, or the recognition that he is about to step beyond the bounds of law and precedent into uncharted and dangerous territory. The Duke of Northumberland stands motionless beside the bed, his face a mask of respectful attention, but you catch the brief flash of satisfaction that crosses his features as Edward nods his approval of the documents. In that moment you understand that whatever the boy king's true feelings, Northumberland has already won this game. The Protestant faction, led by the Duke and supported by ambitious nobles who have grown rich on monastic lands and church silver, will not allow England to slip back into Catholic hands without a fight. As the afternoon light begins to fade outside the palace windows, casting long shadows across the rush-strewn floor, you sense that more than just a young king's life hangs in the balance. The very nature of English monarchy itself is about to be tested in ways that would have been unimaginable even a generation before. Can a king's will, backed by religious conviction but opposed by law and tradition, prevail against the established order of succession? And if it can, what does that mean for the future stability of the realm? The braziers flicker and dance, sending strange patterns of light across the faces of the assembled courtiers, and in those shifting shadows you can almost see the ghosts of future conflicts. The blood that will be spilled, the lives that will be lost, the dreams that will be shattered in the struggle between competing visions of England's destiny. Young Edward coughs again, a harsh sound that echoes off the stone walls, and you realise that time is running short for whatever decision must be made. The boy king's Protestant revolution, born in the reforming zeal of his father and nurtured by ambitious men who saw opportunity in religious change, now stands at its moment of greatest peril. Will it survive the transition from the hands of a dying child to whatever comes next? Or will it perish along with Edward, leaving England to find its way back to the old certainties of Catholic tradition? The answer, you understand, lies not just in the king's failing body, but in the hearts and minds of those who surround him. Men and women whose own futures depend on the choices made in these crucial hours, when the fate of a nation hangs suspended between the prayers of a dying boy and the ambitions of those who would inherit his Protestant kingdom. The boy king's breath grows shorter with each passing hour, yet his resolve to protect Protestant England from Catholic restoration only strengthens. But what price will his determination exact, and who will pay it when the inevitable moment of reckoning arrives? The morning of March 15th brings with it a sharp wind that rattles the diamond-paned windows of Durham House, the London residence of the Duke of Northumberland. You find yourself among the select few permitted entry to witness what history will remember as one of the most audacious political conspiracies ever attempted within the walls of an English noble house. The very air seems thick with whispered promises and barely concealed desperation, for the Protestant cause now hangs by the slenderest of threads. In the Duke's private study, a chamber lined with leather-bound volumes and maps of England's counties, 5 men gather around a table of polished oak. The morning light streaming through tall windows illuminates their faces with an almost holy radiance, yet the business they conduct this day will damn some of them to the scaffold. John Dudley, Duke of Northumberland, presides over this clandestine assembly with the calm authority of a general planning his final desperate campaign. To his right sits his eldest son, John Dudley the Younger, Earl of Warwick, a man whose ambition burns as fiercely as his father's, but whose conscience has not yet been so thoroughly calloused by years of political survival. You can see the slight tremor in his hands as he reaches for his wine cup, the only outward sign of the inner turmoil that must be churning within him. Beside Warwick, Sir Henry Sidney leans forward with the intense concentration of a man who understands that the next few hours will determine whether he rises to unprecedented heights or finds himself decorating Tower Hill with his severed head. But it is the 4th man at this table who draws your closest scrutiny, for he represents the keystone upon which this entire conspiracy must rest. Henry Grey, Duke of Suffolk, sits with the bearing of a man who has been thrust into a role far beyond his natural capacities. His weathered face, marked by years of country living and the simple pleasures of a nobleman more comfortable with hounds than with the complexities of royal succession, shows clear signs of the struggle taking place within his conscience. Suffolk knows, as surely as every man in this room knows, that what they propose will make his 16-year-old daughter Jane the most powerful woman in England, or the youngest person ever to die for treason. The Duke's fingers drum nervously against the table's surface as Northumberland spreads before them a detailed map of London, marking in red ink the locations of the Tower, the royal palaces, and the houses of those nobles whose loyalty must be secured before their plan can succeed. The king grows weaker by the hour, Northumberland begins, his voice carrying the measured tones of a man who has rehearsed these words until they flow like scripture. Doctor, Wendy believes he has perhaps a fortnight remaining, possibly less. We must act swiftly to ensure that when God calls His Majesty home, England does not fall into the hands of those who would restore the papal darkness. The mention of Lady Mary Tudor hangs in the air like the scent of smoke from a heretic's pyre. You have learned through careful listening at court that Mary has spent these past weeks in increasingly fervent prayer at her estate in Hertfordshire, attended by priests who continue to say the forbidden Mass, and surrounded by servants whose loyalty to the old faith runs deeper than their fear of Protestant law. Intelligence reports, whispered by Northumberland's network of informants, suggest that she has already begun reaching out to Catholic nobles throughout England, testing their willingness to support her claim when the inevitable moment arrives. But surely, Suffolk interjects, his voice betraying more uncertainty than he likely intends, the people will never accept the setting aside of King Henry's own daughters. The Lady Mary and the Lady Elizabeth were both restored to the succession by Parliament itself. To exclude them now... Northumberland's response is swift and cutting, delivered with the precision of a blade thrust between ribs. The Lady Mary is a bastard in the eyes of God and the law, your grace. His late Majesty's marriage to Catherine of Aragon was ruled invalid by every court in England. More importantly, she's a papist who would drag England back into submission to Rome. Would you see English children raised once more in ignorance and superstition? Would you watch as the monasteries are rebuilt with stones mortared by Protestant blood? The Duke's words strike their intended target with devastating effect. Suffolk's objections die in his throat, replaced by the uncomfortable silence of a man who recognises the truth in arguments he wishes he could refute. You can see the internal struggle playing out across his features, the loving father who wants to protect his daughter warring against the Protestant nobleman who has grown wealthy from monastery lands and sees his entire fortune threatened by Catholic restoration. Sir Henry Sidney, ever the diplomat, leans forward to bridge the awkward silence. His Grace, the Duke of Northumberland, speaks truth, but we must consider the practical elements of our situation. The Lady Jane is beloved by those who have met her, learned, pious, devoted to the Reformed faith, but she is also unknown to the common people. How do we ensure their acceptance of her claim? It is a question that cuts to the heart of their dilemma, and you can see its weight settling over the assembled conspirators like a burial shroud. Lady Jane Grey, for all her remarkable learning and genuine piety, has lived most of her 16 years in relative obscurity. Unlike her cousins Mary and Elizabeth, who have been fixtures at court since childhood, Jane has spent her time in scholarly pursuits, mastering Greek and Latin, Hebrew and French, theology and philosophy. The people of London know her only by reputation, if they know her at all. Northumberland rises from his chair and moves to the window, gazing out at the Thames where barges laden with goods drift slowly toward the sea. His reflection in the glass shows a man aged beyond his years by the weight of ambition and the constant vigilance required to maintain power in a world where today's ally becomes tomorrow's executioner. The people, he says finally, his words measured and deliberate, will accept what we present to them with sufficient authority and conviction. Remember that His Majesty himself will have signed the letters patent excluding the Lady Mary from succession. This is not usurpation, but the lawful execution of a king's final will. We need only ensure that the transition occurs swiftly and decisively before Mary's supporters can organise resistance. The fifth man at the table, Sir William Herbert, Earl of Pembroke, speaks for the first time since entering the chamber. His voice carries the rough authority of the Welsh borderlands, where he has spent years fighting raiders and rebels with ruthless efficiency. Speed and decisiveness, yes, but we must also consider what follows. The Lady Mary will not simply accept exclusion from her birthright. She has supporters throughout the realm, Catholics who have waited these 6 years for their moment of restoration. Are we prepared for civil war? The question hangs in the air like an executioner's axe, and you can see each man grappling with its implications. Civil war would mean far more than political manoeuvring or palace intrigue. It would mean English armies marching against each other, brother fighting brother, entire families torn apart by competing loyalties. The memory of the Wars of the Roses, though now more than half a century past, still haunts the collective memory of English nobility. But Northumberland's response reveals the depth of his commitment to this dangerous course. If war comes, then we shall fight it and win it. Better a short, sharp conflict that secures Protestant England forever than a gradual slide back into papal tyranny. The Lady Jane has been raised to rule. She understands statecraft, speaks multiple languages, and possesses a theological learning that would shame most bishops. England will be better served by her reign than by the superstitious fumbling of an ageing papist spinster. Suffolk winces visibly at this harsh characterization of Lady Mary, perhaps recognising that similar words might one day be spoken about his own daughter, should this conspiracy fail. But he makes no objection, and you realise that the Duke of Northumberland has judged his fellow conspirators perfectly. Each man at this table has too much to lose from Catholic restoration to abandon the Protestant cause now, regardless of the personal cost. The conversation turns to practical matters, the securing of the tower and its arsenal, the identification of reliable military commanders, the drafting of proclamations to be issued immediately upon Edward's death. You listen with fascination as these men plan the overthrow of England's established succession with the methodical precision of clerks organising a trade expedition. Sir Henry Sidney produces a list of names, nobles, bishops and military officers whose loyalty to the Protestant cause has been tested over the past 6 years. Some are marked in green ink, indicating certain support. Others bear red marks, suggesting probable opposition. But it is the names marked in black that draw your attention, for these represent the men whose loyalty remains uncertain, the swing votes who could determine the success or failure of the entire enterprise. The Earl of Arundel troubles me, Sidney admits, tapping his finger against one of the black-marked names. He has grown rich from monastery lands, yet his family has ancient Catholic roots. Should Mary promise restoration of his ancestral estates? Northumberland cuts him off with a sharp gesture. Arundel will follow strength, as will most of the uncertain ones. They care less about religious doctrine than about their own survival and prosperity. Provide them with sufficient evidence that our cause will triumph, and they will discover sudden enthusiasm for Protestant principles. As the morning progresses into afternoon, the conspiracy takes on an increasingly detailed and concrete form. Messengers will be dispatched to secure key fortifications throughout southern England. The Royal Navy, commanded by officers loyal to the Protestant cause, will be positioned to prevent foreign intervention on Mary's behalf. Most crucially, Lady Jane herself will be brought to London immediately upon Edward's death, to be crowned with all possible speed before opposition can organise. But it is when the conversation turns to Lady Jane's own feelings about this proposed elevation that you sense the first crack in Northumberland's confident facade. Suffolk shifts uncomfortably in his chair as Sidney raises the obvious question. Has the Lady Jane been informed of these plans? Does she consent to her own coronation? The silence that follows this query is pregnant with uncomfortable implications. You realise that despite all their careful planning, these men have not yet confronted the possibility that their chosen monarch might refuse the crown they offer her. Lady Jane Grey, by all accounts, is a young woman of strong religious convictions and scholarly temperament, more comfortable with books than with the brutal realities of political power. Northumberland's response, when it comes, reveals for the first time a hint of uncertainty beneath his confident exterior. The Lady Jane is young and has been raised to obedience. When the moment comes, she will understand her duty to God and to England. The Protestant cause has no more devoted adherent than she. But even as he speaks these words, you can see doubt flickering in the Duke's eyes. For all his political acumen and manipulative skill, even Northumberland cannot control the conscience of a 16-year-old girl who has been raised to believe in divine providence and moral duty above worldly ambition. The meeting concludes with assignments distributed among the conspirators and plans laid for the crucial days ahead. As the men rise from the table, you cannot help but notice how each seems diminished by the weight of what they have undertaken. They are no longer merely Protestant nobles defending their faith. They have become revolutionaries plotting to overturn the established order of English monarchy itself. The afternoon sun slants through the windows as they prepare to depart, casting long shadows across the maps and documents that litter the table. In those shadows, you can almost see the ghosts of all those who will die in the coming struggle, the loyal servants who will choose the wrong side, the common soldiers who will fall in battles fought for causes they barely understand, and perhaps even some of these very conspirators should their desperate gamble fail. As the Duke of Northumberland locks the incriminating documents away in an iron strongbox, his movements betraying none of the inner turmoil he must feel, you understand that events have now passed beyond the point of return. The die has been cast, and England will soon discover whether Protestant determination can triumph over Tudor legitimacy, whether religious conviction can overcome the ancient claims of blood and law. The conspiracy is set in motion, but its success depends on factors beyond any man's control. The timing of a young king's death, the loyalty of uncertain nobles, and most critically, the willingness of a scholarly 16-year-old girl to accept a crown that may prove to be her death warrant. The web of conspiracy spreads across Protestant England, but at its centre sits a reluctant spider, Lady Jane Grey herself, unaware that powerful men are weaving her fate with threads that may prove to be her burial shroud. What will happen when the innocent scholar is finally told she must become a queen? The 6th day of July, in the year of our Lord 1553, dawns grey and cheerless over Greenwich Palace, as if the very heavens mourn what is about to unfold. You stand in the outer chamber of the king's apartments, listening to the death rattle that has echoed through these halls for the past 3 days. Edward VI, the boy who would remake England in God's image, lies dying at barely 15 years of age, his body consumed by what the physicians now openly acknowledge as the sweating sickness, though some still whisper of slower, more deliberate poisons. The scent of burning frankincense mingles with the sharper odours of medicinal herbs and approaching death, creating an atmosphere that seems suspended between prayer and desperation. Protestant bishops huddle in corners, their black robes making them appear like ravens waiting for carrion, while courtiers who have built their fortunes on the boy king's favour pace the corridors with the restless energy of men who sense their world ending. At 9 o'clock in the evening, as the summer twilight finally surrenders to darkness, a profound silence settles over the royal apartments. Dr. Thomas Wendy emerges from the king's bedchamber, his face bearing the grave expression that announces what words need not speak. Edward VI, by the grace of God, King of England, France and Ireland, defender of the faith and of the Church of England and also of Ireland in earth the supreme head, has breathed his last. The moment his death becomes known, the palace transforms into a hive of barely controlled activity. Servants scurry through corridors carrying sealed messages, while guards take up positions at strategic doorways with the precision of men following long-rehearsed orders. The Duke of Northumberland, who has maintained a vigil in the outer chamber throughout the king's final hours, wastes no time in assuming command of the situation. "Secure all gates," he commands Sir Henry Sidney in a voice that carries clearly through the hushed chamber. "No one enters or leaves without my explicit permission. The king's death must remain secret until we have completed the necessary arrangements." The necessity for secrecy is paramount, for Mary Tudor must not learn of her brother's death until Lady Jane Grey has been safely installed as Queen and the machinery of government secured in Protestant hands. You watch with fascination as Northumberland's conspiracy unfolds with the mechanical precision of a clockwork device. Messengers ride through the darkness toward predetermined destinations, carrying letters that will summon loyal nobles to London while simultaneously misdirecting potential enemies away from the capital. The Tower of London, that ancient fortress which has served as both palace and prison to English royalty, prepares to receive its newest occupant, though whether Lady Jane Grey will enter as sovereign or prisoner remains to be determined by events yet to unfold. Meanwhile, at Sion House, the Duke of Northumberland's riverside estate some 10 miles west of London, Lady Jane Grey sits in, blissful ignorance of the crown that awaits her. You can envision her in her private chamber, perhaps reading by candlelight from one of the Greek texts that have become her passion, or composing letters in Latin to continental scholars who have praised her remarkable learning. At 16, she possesses an intellect that would shame most university graduates, speaking fluent Greek, Latin, Hebrew, French, and Italian, with a grasp of theology that rivals ordained ministers. But intellectual brilliance, as Jane is about to discover, provides little protection against the brutal realities of political ambition. On the morning of July 9th, 3 days after Edward's carefully concealed death, a delegation arrives at Sion House that will forever alter the trajectory of her young life. The Duke and Duchess of Northumberland, accompanied by Jane's own parents, the Duke and Duchess of Suffolk, approach the estate with the solemnity of mourners attending a funeral, which, in a sense, they are. You can imagine the scene as Jane receives her unexpected visitors in the great hall of Sion House, a chamber whose soaring arches and magnificent tapestries speak of wealth and power beyond the comprehension of common mortals. She curtsies respectfully to the assembled nobility, her movements displaying the grace and dignity instilled by years of careful education, entirely unaware that these same people have been plotting to place an unimaginably heavy burden upon her slender shoulders. The Duchess of Northumberland, a woman whose political acumen matches that of her ambitious husband, takes the lead in the conversation that follows. Her words, carefully chosen and delivered with motherly concern, begin the process of preparing Jane for the shocking revelation that awaits her. "My dear child," she begins, her voice weighted with artificial grief, "we bring the most sorrowful news. His Majesty King Edward, our beloved sovereign and defender of the true faith, has been called to his eternal reward. England mourns the loss of the most godly prince who ever graced the English throne." Jane's reaction to this news reveals the genuine piety that has shaped her character from childhood. She falls to her knees immediately, not in submission to earthly authority, but in prayer for the soul of her young cousin, tears streaming down her pale cheeks as she contemplates the loss of a king she has genuinely loved and respected. For several minutes, the only sounds in the great hall are Jane's whispered prayers and the soft rustle of silk garments as the assembled nobles wait for her grief to subside. But when Jane finally raises her head, composed despite her tears and ready to hear whatever additional sorrows these visitors might bring, the Duchess of Northumberland delivers the words that will transform a scholar into a reluctant queen. His late Majesty, in his final hours and with the full consent of his Privy Council, saw fit to alter the succession established by his father. Recognising the threat that Catholic restoration would pose to England's spiritual welfare, he has excluded both the Lady Mary and the Lady Elizabeth from inheritance of the crown. You, dear Jane, as the nearest Protestant heir in the Tudor line, have been named his successor. You are Queen of England. The silence that follows this announcement stretches for what feels like an eternity. Jane remains kneeling on the stone floor, her face cycling through expressions of disbelief, horror, and desperate comprehension as the full implications of these words settle into her consciousness. This is not the gentle elevation to noble marriage that her parents have long planned for her, nor the scholarly retirement she has dreamed of pursuing. This is a crown that comes wrapped in revolution, a throne built upon the overthrow of lawful succession, a queenship that may well end in martyrdom. When Jane finally finds her voice, her words reveal both the strength of character that has impressed her tutors and the innocent faith that makes her entirely unsuited for the brutal world she's about to enter. "I cannot accept this honour. I am not worthy of such elevation, nor do I possess the wisdom necessary to rule England. Surely there are others better qualified than a mere girl of 16 years. The Duke of Northumberland steps forward at this crucial moment, his voice carrying the authority of a man accustomed to bending others to his will. "Your Majesty speaks from modesty, but modesty is a luxury that England cannot afford in this hour of crisis. God himself has chosen you as his instrument to preserve Protestant England from papal tyranny. To refuse would be to abandon your Christian duty and condemn your countrymen to spiritual darkness. It is a masterful manipulation, appealing simultaneously to Jane's religious devotion and her sense of responsibility while framing her refusal as both cowardice and apostasy. You can see the internal struggle playing out across Jane's face as she wrestles with obligations that seem to pull her in opposite directions, duty to God against duty to law, religious conviction against personal desire, the commands of powerful men against the whispers of her own conscience. Her father, the Duke of Suffolk, adds his own voice to the pressure being applied to his daughter. Jane, you have been raised to serve God and England. This is how Providence has chosen for you to fulfill that service. Your learning, your piety, your devotion to reformed religion, all of this has been preparation for this moment. Will you turn away from God's calling? The assembled nobles watch in tense silence as Jane struggles with perhaps the most momentous decision any 16-year-old has ever been asked to make. The crown they offer her is not the glittering symbol of fairy tales, but a burden that has already cost one king his life, and may well cost her own. Yet to refuse means abandoning the Protestant cause she's been raised to. Cherish, potentially condemning England to what she genuinely believes would be spiritual catastrophe under Catholic rule. When Jane finally speaks again, her voice is barely above a whisper, but her words carry the weight of destiny. If it is truly God's will that I should serve England in this capacity, then I must submit to his providence, however unworthy I may be. But I pray that Almighty God will grant me the wisdom and strength necessary for so great a responsibility. The transformation that follows her acceptance is swift and dramatic. Within hours, Jane finds herself transported from the scholarly quiet of Sion House to the imposing majesty of the Tower of London, where English monarchs have traditionally spent the night before their coronations. But as her barge glides along the Thames toward the fortress whose white walls have witnessed so much royal triumph and tragedy, Jane cannot shake the ominous feeling that she is sailing not toward a coronation, but toward her own destruction. The Tower receives its new queen with all the ceremony due to royal majesty, but you can see in Jane's eyes that she recognises the fortress's dual nature as both palace and prison. The same walls that will shelter her during these early days of her reign have also confined some of England's most famous victims of political ambition. The very chamber where she will sleep has housed condemned prisoners awaiting execution, and the chapel where she will pray has witnessed the final confessions of those who dared to challenge Tudor authority. On July 10th, 1553, Lady Jane Grey is formally proclaimed Queen of England in a ceremony that manages to be both magnificent and hollow. The heralds cry her name through the streets of London, with voices that carry more duty than conviction, while the crowds that gather to witness this historic moment respond with silence more telling than any applause. The common people of London, whatever their feelings about religious doctrine, understand the fundamental violation of law and custom that Jane's elevation represents. Standing on the tower's battlements as the proclamation echoes through the city below, Jane presents a figure both tragic and inspiring. Clad in cloth of gold that emphasises her youth rather than concealing it, she looks less like a conquering monarch than like a sacrifice adorned for some ancient ritual. Her face, pale with the weight of responsibility and the first stirrings of genuine fear, shows the dawning realisation that the crown she's accepted may prove to be her death warrant. The first cracks in Northumberland's carefully constructed conspiracy appear almost immediately. Word of Edward's death and Jane's elevation spreads through England with the speed of wildfire, and the reaction is not what the Protestant conspirators had hoped. Rather than accepting the fait accompli of Jane's coronation, the English people begin to demonstrate their fundamental respect for legitimate succession and their affection for the daughter of the great Henry VIII. Reports arrive at the Tower with alarming frequency. The Earl of Bath has declared for Mary Tudor in the West Country. The Lord Lieutenant of Norfolk has proclaimed Mary as rightful queen. Even more ominously, several ships of the Royal Navy have mutinied and sailed to join Mary's cause. With each messenger who arrives bearing news of defections and declarations for Mary, Jane's reign appears less like a triumph of Protestant virtue, and more like a desperate gamble that is failing with each passing hour. The Duke of Northumberland, recognising that his conspiracy is unravelling faster than he had anticipated, makes the fatal decision to leave London with a military force to confront Mary Tudor directly. But his departure from the capital proves to be the beginning of the end for Jane's brief reign, as even his closest allies begin to question their commitment to a cause that seems increasingly doomed to failure. Within 9 days of her proclamation, Jane Grey will discover that crowns won by conspiracy are easily lost by abandonment. The Protestant nobility who had seemed so committed to her cause proved remarkably flexible in their loyalties when faced with the prospect of backing a losing side. The same men who had proclaimed her queen will soon compete to be the first to proclaim Mary Tudor, hoping that early submission might earn them mercy from the rightful heir they had attempted to exclude. But for now, in these final hours of her brief reign, Jane Grey stands alone on the Tower battlements, gazing out over a London that has never truly accepted her as queen, knowing in her heart that the crown she wears is not a symbol of authority, but a target painted on her young life. The Protestant Revolution that began with such hope in the reign of her cousin Edward is about to end in failure and bloodshed, and she, the reluctant scholar who never sought power, will pay the ultimate price for other men's ambitions. The bells of London's churches ring out in the gathering dusk, their bronze voices carrying across the Thames the ancient rhythms of English faith. Soon those same bells will ring for Mary Tudor's triumph, and the brief, tragic reign of Queen Jane will become nothing more than a cautionary tale about the perils of placing crowns on unwilling heads and building thrones upon the shifting sands of religious revolution. Thus ended the Protestant dream that began with such promise in the reign of the boy King Edward VI. Within 9 days, Lady Jane Grey would lose both crown and head, her brief reign serving a stark reminder that in the deadly game of royal succession, good intentions provide no protection against the inexorable demands of political reality and the ancient claims of Tudor blood.